for me, made me go and search for resources around that of like, if you're not a native speaker, how do you do that? And I got a lot of perspectives from like the white mother perspective, which is great. I'm so happy that they're raising bilingual children, but it's a different situation when your language has been lost because of generational trauma. And to bring it back and to try to resurrect it in your family lineage takes a culturally responsive perspective, takes healing, takes a trauma-informed perspective.
What do you do when you're a Latina mom who wants to raise a bilingual child but you don't speak Spanish? How can you work to overcome shame when it's connected to the language? In this episode, Latina mom of two and Harvard-educated doctora of education, Vero Benavides shares her personal multilingual parenting journey. Join us as we talk about the differences in raising a bilingual child when you come from generational and cultural trauma. And we give you tips to help you work on yourself and retrain your mindset. Plus, Vero shares her techniques for raising trilingual kids all the way from Denmark. Yo, a Latina mom, bilingual parenting educator, and now author Janny Perez te invito as we take a closer look. Así que no te lo pierdas. Welcome to another episode of the Latina Mom Legacy Podcast. I am your host, Janny Perez. ¿Cómo estás? ¿Cómo estás? If this is your first time listening, thank you for tuning in. Today we have part one of a two-part episode with Dr. Vero Benavides. In this part one, Vero shares with us her personal journey raising trilingual children when she came from a place of shame and generational trauma attached to Spanish. So I can't wait to share this episode with you today. But first, let me tell you what's going on in our legacy community. So first, I have to say huge congrats to you for getting the Latina Mom Legacy Podcast to number 34 people in the parenting category on Apple Podcasts. This is huge. So let me tell you how huge this is. Out of 78,206 parenting podcasts, we peaked at number 34. This is like, just want to say, Eva Longoria, you're next on my list to interview, okay? So if any of Eva's people are listening, hello, I would like to have her on my show. So last week I mentioned to my Spotify subscribers, if you're a Spotify subscriber, mil gracias. And I had mentioned that I was going to create a poll because in Spotify now they have like these like questions and polls that you can post. But I spent like an hour trying to create this poll, and let me just tell you, it turns out that I can't post polls or questions on Spotify because the podcast falls under the kids and family category. And I guess that when you're under the kids and family category, because of the child sensitivity, which I totally get, they don't allow you to post polls or questions. So I was just like, no, but why? So anyway, I can't post polls or questions on Spotify. So I posted the question on Instagram. And the question was, what type of legacy do you want to leave for your kids? And Stephanie M. Thomas responded that she wanted to leave a financial, spiritual, and cultural legacy, which I absolutely love. I gave you 5 or 6 tips on how to create a legacy. I totally spaced out and didn't include a spiritual legacy. And this, for me personally, this is like at the top of my list, right? I definitely want to leave a spiritual legacy for my daughter, for Victoria. I want her to grow up knowing that there is something bigger than herself and believing in something bigger than herself. Definitely at the top of my list. So Stephanie, thanks for sharing. Today, I want to pose a new question, and I encourage you to respond in the gram on Instagram. So today, I want to pose a new question. Do you come from a place of shame, generational, or cultural trauma attached to language, attached to Spanish? And if so, how are you overcoming it, or do you need help to overcome it? So you can share on Instagram at milegacy, spelled MILEGASI. Just look at this episode's post and you can answer there, and I'll share your answer with our community. So next on the list, this Saturday at 12 p.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. PST time, we have our bilingual parenting support meetup. This is our monthly meetup. It's happening via Zoom. It's free for everyone that has taken the online course, How to Raise a Bilingual Spanish Child Practically. This is my course. It's free for if you're enrolled or if you have taken the course already. And this is just our monthly check-in to sort of see where you're at and how your journey is going. So that's happening this Saturday, April 29th. Next Saturday, May 6th, I'm having a free masterclass, 4 Steps to Raising a Bilingual Child with Confidence. So you can sign up for that at calendly.com/milegacy, spelled MILEGASI. If you can't make it next Saturday, hit me up on Instagram and just tell me that you want to sign up for the class. I'll add you to June's waitlist. And that's about all that's going on in our community. If you want to connect with me again, you can hit me up on Instagram at milegacy, spelled MILEGASI. And nada, let's get on to the show, what you've been waiting for. Today's conversation is with Dr. Vero Benavides. She's a Harvard-educated doctora of education. Vero has spent her career exploring and advocating for the intersection of identity, language, and learning. Throughout her career in education, she's always sought to create strengths-based environments where all people and children thrive. Now as founder and CEO of the Language Preservation Project, Dr. Benavides works to support the reclamation and flourishing of heritage languages across global contexts. Today, we're going to learn more about her multilingual parenting journey. Así que espero que te guste and hopefully you'll learn a little something today. Bueno, I'll talk to you soon. Ciao, ciao. I am so excited to have today's conversation with Dr. Vero Benavides, but we are going to call her Vero. Vero, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to dive into a conversation with you.
Yes, we're going to be talking a little bit about shame when it comes to language. We're going to be talking about the importance of really diving deep and reclaiming our heritage language for ourselves and for our children and what that looks like. And we'll talk about her journey in this and her experience helping other parents and families in this. But first, let's get to know you a little bit better. Vero, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I grew up in Texas, in Houston, Texas, and my parents both came from the Rio Grande Valley. If you're familiar with that, it's along the border of southern Texas, the tip of Texas, and they were the first in their family to go to school at any point, at any level of school. And when they arrived, they spoke only Spanish because that was their home language and their community language. And at that point in South Texas, they were physically punished when they spoke Spanish in school because Spanish wasn't allowed. It was an English-only environment. And so pretty quickly, they internalized that Spanish was something that was bad in an academic setting. And that Spanish was something that wasn't going to get them academically ahead or professionally ahead or have that kind of upward mobility that they wanted for themselves and for their future generations. So I didn't really understand all of that context when I was growing up as a little girl in Houston, Texas. All I really knew was that there was Spanish around me. My family spoke Spanish, but I didn't speak Spanish. My parents spoke to us, me and my siblings, in English. And there was never really any narrative or story around why it was important to speak Spanish. If you can believe it, my grandma, my only living grandparent, only spoke Spanish, did not speak English. So we couldn't really communicate with her. And yet there wasn't really any messaging or narrative or questioning that hey, this is something that we should hold on to, or this is something that we should learn. And that was kind of my K-12 education, not feeling super connected to my language or my identity as a Latina until I got to college. And it was taking me out of the waters of a Black and brown community and putting me in a predominantly white institution. I was okay, this is different. I am not white, right? I come from a different place. I have a different identity. And I started to take ethnic studies classes and started to kind of dig into curriculum and resources that I had never been exposed to as a child, saw myself reflected, saw the contributions of our people. And I was wow, this is something that I should be proud of. This is something that I should hold on to. This is something that has value. So it was really at that point in college when I dove back into learning more about my roots and identity and language. And I could go on in terms of where that took me. I became an educator, but that is kind of where I come from and the story that I carry with me.
It's such a powerful story because I think that many first generation Latinas, perhaps second generation Latinas, come from a place where their parents perhaps spoke Spanish, but they themselves were either shamed to speak the language. They were afraid to speak the language, and perhaps they felt like they didn't want that for their kids. Right? I think that when you're in
an English environment. Like I grew up in Hialeah. Everybody spoke Spanish. Like my environment was all mostly Spanish speaking. So I didn't have that experience. But I know that, and speaking to so many moms that where they grew up in a mostly English environment, and it sort of creates that duality. Like, where do I fit in these both worlds? As you grow up and as you have children, it's when you start to realize the importance of what all that means. As an adult, you kind of see things differently because you don't want certain things that were passed down to you. You don't want to pass that forward.
I want to go back a little bit to what you mentioned about the different ways in which our community loses connection to their language. And it could be that they grow up in a mostly English, speaking environment, or in a community like a white community that doesn't have, access to that. I grew up in a Black and Brown community that had a lot of Spanish speaking people around me, a lot of Spanish, it was in my home, it was in my community. I passively understood it. When I got to school, my parents were told by educators that speaking to us in Spanish would confuse us. Bilingualism wasn't cultivated in the school setting. It wasn't like if we came in as, having some foundation in the Spanish language, which I think if you understand it, that is a form of bilingualism, that wasn't seen as an asset that should be developed. And so I say that to point out that even in communities that are Spanish speaking, that have all of these cultural assets, that have students that speak the language, there's often a missed opportunity in school settings where it's not seen as a gift. It's not seen as an asset. Sometimes children are labeled as English language learners, or they're seen as having deficits or being on a delayed track. And so that's a lot of why I got into education before I even became a parent, that I was like, hey, I came from a community that had a lot of resources, but we were labeled low income, we were labeled at risk, we were labeled all of these deficit labels that didn't really help us to see that we had a lot of stuff going for us that was worth protecting and worth cultivating. And I think that that's really important to name, and a lot of why at the Language Preservation Project, which I founded not too long ago, that we work with both home and school environments, because to preserve these heritage languages, we need to work across those two settings. To speak to my children, I became an educator because of this passion for having environments that were culturally and linguistically affirming for children. And I taught in schools for a long time in New York, in Mexico City, in Cambridge. I got my doctorate in education leadership. I was the executive director at Bank Street College of Education at their Center on Culture, Race, and Equity. Mm-hmm. So when I had my first child, my son, I was like, I am so ready for this. I am an educator. I am going to have the most culturally responsive, woke, Spanish-speaking child that there ever was. And then I had my son, and it completely broke me open, because having a child is an incredibly vulnerable experience. It brings up all of the stuff that you might have been trying to push down for a long time. Mm-hmm. And it brought up for me, while I had learned the language, it brought up for me a lot of fear and shame that even though I spoke Spanish now, I was like, well, if I speak to him in Spanish or try to raise him in Spanish, it's not as strong as my English. Am I going to mess him up? Or am I if I make a mistake, is that a bad thing? Or should I just be focusing on this? And so I had a lot of insecurities and fears about raising him in Spanish, because I wasn't as confident in that language as I was in English. And that for me made me go and search for resources around that of if you're not a native speaker, how do you do that? And I got a lot of perspectives from the white mother perspective, which is great. I'm so happy that they're raising bilingual children, but it's a different situation when your language has been lost because of generational trauma. And to bring it back and to try to resurrect it in your family lineage takes a culturally responsive perspective, takes healing, takes a trauma-informed perspective. And so that's a part of also why we created the Language Preservation Project, is for us to do that in community with each other.
In your research of all these non-native Spanish-speaking communities, you came across women from different ethnic backgrounds that wanted to teach their children Spanish? What was the biggest difference that you saw in terms of how you could relate to them?
I think that's a great question. For me, in going through this journey, had to deal with a lot of shame around my language. And I don't think that that's something that folks who are learning a language without any familial or cultural connection to the language have to deal with. Maybe they're afraid of, speaking the language and making a mistake, which is something universally we can relate to. But for me, it was tied to my family, the representation of my community. It was tied to my sense of belonging. It was tied to a fear of what would happen to my children if they didn't have this part of identity. And so it was much more personal, much deeper, much more complex. And I found affinity in other parents who were trying to do the same thing, who had maybe lost the heritage language in their generation or the generation before, and then we're trying to pass it down. And I think that's really important to elevate, to say that it's possible, because for so long, systemically and then internally, like in our communities, we would hear that isn't possible, that it is too hard, or that you shouldn't do it, or that the research says this and the science says that. And that's just not true.
100%. I couldn't agree with you more.
So you have 2 kids. They are 5 and 2. Tell us a little bit about how you're navigating that. Like now, where are you at? Like, do you speak Spanish? Do you speak English to them? Tell us a little bit about that journey with them.
My son was born in New York City, and my daughter was born in Copenhagen, and very different experiences, if you can imagine. So we were in New York City with my son for a year and a half, and I decided to raise him in Spanish at that point, and probably pretty naively. I was like, yeah, I'm just going to speak to him in Spanish, and didn't think about how hard it is to learn so much of this vocabulary. Like if you didn't grow up with it, to learn all of this vocabulary around baby stuff that me learning Spanish as an adult, I never really had to use. And so I had to really adopt a learner's mindset and really move away from the desire for perfectionism to showing my son that it's okay to make mistakes, that we are learning this together, that the goal is connection and not perfection here. And so for many of the early years in his life, it was looking up a ton of words and trying to create a language rich environment, because, I'm an early childhood educator and I know that really language rich environments are important. So doing that in Spanish, but also in the meantime, building my vocabulary list, studying it while I'm breastfeeding, trying to grow my vocabulary as much as possible. And then it was easier with my daughter because I had years of practice with my son. And continues to be both easier in terms of my comfort, which is speaking in Spanish all the time to them, but more difficult as my son gets older because, I have to explain more complex topics to him and continue to grow and stretch myself. And I have a Spanish teacher still that I have conversations with, because my mom, though she's a Spanish speaker, will never, ever correct me, or will just doesn't provide that support that I would need there.
It's important what you mentioned, that you have a Spanish teacher. It's important that you mentioned that you're teaching your children that it's okay to make mistakes, because that's one thing that I say time and time again, that the goal isn't perfection. It really isn't. And as you grew up with shame associated to the language, you don't want them to associate the language with either pain or resentment. If you focus on creating that bond and that connection first, and vulnerability, in terms of showing them that, hey, my Spanish is not perfect. I make mistakes too. Let me Google it. Let me look it up. Let me pick up a dictionary and let's learn together. With my daughter, now we're reading and I have a dictionary right by the bed. We read and it's she's like, Mom, what is that? I'm like, I don't know. Let me look it up. And we learn together and we stretch ourselves. So it's important that you, the mom listening or the parent listening, that you understand that your goal should not be perfection, because you're in that pursuit of perfection. When you make a mistake, you're going to feel horrible and you're going to not want to continue. Here is an educator's perspective on how you can raise a bilingual child, even when you come from a background of shame.
Exactly. Amen to that. Yes, yes, yes. And I think a big mindset shift that I had to go through was right in the beginning when I was, dealing with all the shame and wondering if I was making the right decision. I reevaluated my own relationship to my parents and heritage language, because for a long time I was like, they should have taught me Spanish. Like, they knew Spanish and they didn't speak it to me. And, I wish that they did that. And I always had this like, if they just would have done that, then things would have been so much easier for me. And then I thought about all of the oppression that they went through around their heritage language. And I was like, it's amazing that I even grew up passively bilingual, given that. Mm-hmm. What they passed on to me was a gift. It was better than nothing. It made speaking Spanish, when I decided to dive into that, so much easier. And then I needed to adopt that perspective for myself, that like, whatever I pass on to my child is good enough and better than nothing. It doesn't have to be perfect, right? Even if it is a passive bilingualism, that is a gift, given the environment in which we live and how each word in non-English is an act of resistance for us in a lot of ways.
And if you're listening and you're like, what is passive bilingualism? Let me just give you a clear definition. It's when you understand the language, but you don't necessarily speak it. That is the case in many homes. But to your point, it is a gift regardless. I obviously vouch and say, if you can speak to them a lot in Spanish, then, try your best to do that, because that's only going to encourage them to have more conversation with you. But at the very least, if they grow up around it, hearing it, then they'll get something out of it for sure.
Yes.
Hi there. Dr. Alfie here, inviting you to come join us at the Acoma Project, May 16th and 17th, for Revelations, Uncovering Truths about the Mental Health of Youth of Color, a virtual event focused on a critical topic for a vital population. Please join us.
Now you're living in Denmark. How is the language structure in your home now that you're there?
Yeah, great question. So we employ a variety of methods. My partner speaks to the children exclusively in Danish, and I speak to the children in Spanish. And then we do a bit, my partner and I speak to each other in English. So the children hear English pretty consistently when we're speaking. And then we do dinner time in English. So we pick a time and place to use English. And then media, like all media that we have, like if they watch movies on Fridays or things like that, that's in Spanish, because that's the minority language here. Mm-hmm. We're not so concerned about English acquisition in Denmark, because Denmark is a completely bilingual country. It's a really great example of like how to create systems that create bilingual children. I think sometimes in the US, we think that bilingualism is a very difficult thing to do. Mm-hmm. And in Europe, it's just like, in most of the world, it's mm-hmm. a completely multilingual mm-hmm. Place. And so we're not so concerned about English, and know that the children will absorb it. And for me, I know that like each language acquisition is made easier and supported by a strong foundation in your primary languages. And so our children are going to learn to read and write in Danish from school. And for me, I'm trying to teach them the foundations of reading and writing in Spanish, and know that if they have those strong foundations in both of those languages, that when they get to English reading and writing acquisition, it'll be so much easier.
Agree 100%. I like that they're getting one language from one person and another language from another person, and that together you speak another language in a setting. How do they mostly communicate with you guys?
Our family, the consistency around whatever strategy it is, right? Like if it is that you're choosing that one parent will speak one language and another parent will speak another language, or that, you'll do it during this time and place, you have to do it consistently. Like it took a while from when we started doing English at dinner time before the kids started talking in English. And it was also a consistent prompt that we had every day at dinner to get them speaking. We said, what are you happy for today? And then we would help them like practice what they like. Are you happy for the food? Are you? And so like after 5 years of doing that, right, that my son can speak pretty freely on the topic.
Notice that you said after 5 years. That's the other big aha moment. If you're listening, is that she didn't say after 5 months. She didn't say after 15 months. She said after 5 years. My daughter she's turning 8 in a few days, and she just started rolling her R's. Like she just started. We've worked on this for years, not even months, years. So you have to have patience. You have to have patience when you're doing this, and not expect immediate results. I know, because we're so used to seeing everything happen like now, like we want to see results like right now. But with this, you have to give it time and you have to be patient.
Yeah, exactly. And I